The Master of Hestviken by Sigrid Undset. Translated from the Norwegian by Arthur G. Chater. Book 1. The Axe. Part 1. Olav Audunsson takes a wife. Chapter 1. The Steinfinnsons was the name folk gave to a kin that flourished in the country about Lake Mjøsa at the time the sons of Harald Gill held sway in Norway. In those days, men of that stock held manors in every parish that bordered the lake. In the years of trouble which later came upon the land, the Steinfinnsons thought most of keeping their estates unshorn and their manors unburnt, and for the most part they were strong enough to succeed in this, whether the Birchlegs or any of the opposing bands were to the fore in the uplands. They seemed not to care greatly who in the end might be kings in Norway. But some of the men of this line had served King Magnus Erlingsson, and later Sigurd Marcus Fostre, faithfully and well. And none of them had aided Sverre and his kinsmen more than they could help. Old Tor Steinfinnsson of Hove and his sons joined the cause of King Skule, but when there was once more peace in the land, they paid allegiance to King Hakon. But from that time the family began to lose something of its repute. The country was now quieter, and law and justice prevailed between man and man. Their power was then greatest who held the king's authority, who had served in the royal bodyguard and won the king's trust. But the Steinfinnsons stayed at home upon their lands and were content to govern their own estates. They were yet a wealthy kindred. The Steinfinnsons had been the last of the great upland lords to own thralls, and they still took the offspring of their freedmen into service, or made them tenants on their land. Among the people round about, it was whispered that the Steinfinnsons were a race greedy of power, but they had the wit to choose such liegemen as should be easy to deal with. The men of the kin had no name for being of the wisest, but foolish they could not be called, since they had shown such good sense in the preserving of their estates. And they were not harsh lords towards those of less degree, so long as none offered to raise his voice against them. Now, 2 years before King Hakon the Old died, young Tor Torresson of Hove sent his youngest son, Steinfinn, to the royal bodyguard. His age was then 18. He was a handsome, well-grown man, but it was with him as with his kinsmen. Folk knew them by their horses and their clothes, their arms and jewels. But if young Steinfinn had donned a coarse peasant's cloak, many a man would hardly have known him, of those who had called him friend and boon companion over the ale tankards the night before. The Steinfinnsons were goodly men for the most, but, as the saying was, they were lost in the crowd of church folks, and of this Steinfinn his fellows used to say that his wit was none too bad, but that it was as nothing to his arrogance. Now Steinfinn was in Bjorgvin, and there he met a maiden, Ingeborg Jonsdatter, who had her place at the king's court with Queen Ingeborg. She and Steinfinn took a liking for one another, and he had his suit preferred with her father. But John answered that his daughter was already promised to Matthias Haraldsson, a dear friend of young King Magnus and one of his bodyguard. But it seemed Steinfinn could not take his rejection in earnest. He came again many times, and had men of mark, and at last Queen Ingeborg herself, to plead his cause. It availed nothing, for John Palsson would not break his word to Matthias. Steinfinn followed King Hakon in his last warfaring west over sea. In the fight at Largs he won fair renown for valour. While the king lay sick at Kirkevaag, Steinfinn often had the night watch by his side, and at least he himself thought that King Hakon had shown him great favour. The next summer Steinfinn was again in Bjorgvin, and one fine morning, just after John's Mass, as some of the Queen's maidens were coming from Nonneseta toward the king's house, they met Steinfinn and his body servant riding through the street. They were leading a fine horse, which Steinfinn said he had bought that morning, as they saw it, with bridle and woman's saddle. He greeted the damsels with courtesy and blithe jesting, and would have them try this horse of his. They then went all together to a meadow and diverted themselves a while. But when Ingeborg Jonsdatter was in the saddle, Steinfinn said that she must have the loan of the horse to ride back to the king's court, and he would go with her. The next that was heard of these two was that they had passed through Vors and taken to the hills. At last they reached Hove. Tor seemed at first ill-pleased at his son's misdeed, but afterwards he gave him a homestead, Pretestein, which lay remote in the forest tracts. There he lived with Ingeborg Jonsdatter as though they had been lawfully wedded, and he held a christening ale with the most lavish hospitality when she bore him a daughter next spring. Nothing was done to him, either for the rape of the woman or for his flight from the bodyguard. Folk said he could thank Queen Ingeborg for that. And at last the Queen made a reconciliation between the young couple and John Palsson. He gave Steinfinn his daughter in marriage, and held their wedding at the king's court in Oslo, where he was then a courtier. At that time Ingeborg was expecting her third child, but neither she nor Steinfinn showed becoming humility toward John, or thanked him as they ought for his fatherly kindness. Steinfinn gave costly gifts to his wife's father and her kinsmen, but in other ways both he and his wife were very overweening, and behaved as though all their life had been honourable, nor had they any need to humble themselves in order to retrieve their position. They brought their elder daughter Ingunn to the wedding, and Steinfinn danced with her on his arm and showed her to all who were there. She was 3 years old, and her parents were proud beyond measure of this fair child. But their first son died, whom Ingeborg bore close upon their marriage, and after that she had stillborn twins, both boys. Then the two bowed the knee to John Palsson and besought his pardon with contrite hearts. Thereafter Ingeborg had 2 sons who lived. She grew fairer with every year that passed. She and Steinfinn lived together in affection, maintained a great house, and were merry and of good cheer. One man there was of whom none seemed to take thought, Matthias Haraldsson, Ingeborg's rightful bridegroom, whom she had played false. He went into foreign lands at the time Steinfinn's wedding was held, and he stayed away for many years. Matthias was a little man and ill-favoured, but mettlesome, hardy, and of great wealth. Steinfinn and Ingeborg had been married 7 years or thereabouts, and their daughters Ingunn and Tora were 10 and 8 winters old, but the sons were quite small, when Matthias Haraldsson came one night with an armed band to Pretestein. It was at haymaking, and many of the housefolk were away on the outlying pastures. Those who were at home were overpowered as they lay asleep. Steinfinn did not wake until he was pulled out of the bed where he slept with his wife. The summer was warm that year, so folk lay naked. Steinfinn was as bare as his mother bore him as he stood bound by his own board, with 3 men holding him. The Lady Ingeborg defended herself like a wild beast, with tooth and nail, while Matthias wrapped the coverlet about her, lifted her out of the bed, and set her on his knees. Matthias said to Steinfinn, "Now, could I take such vengeance as you two deserve? And you, Steinfinn, should stand there a bound man with no power to protect your wife, if I had a mind to take her, who was promised to me and never to you. But I have more fear of breaking God's law, and I take more heed of good morals than you. So now I will chasten you, Steinfinn, for letting you take back your wife inviolate, by my favour. And you, my Ingeborg, dwell with your man, and peace be with you both. After this night, I think you will remember to thank me each time you embrace in joy and gladness, he said with a loud laugh. He kissed the lady and laid her in the bed, calling to his men that now they should ride away. Then he turned to Steinfinn. Steinfinn had not uttered a word, and as he saw he could not break loose, he stood still. But his face was a deep crimson, and he did not take his eyes off Matthias. The other went close up to him. "If you don't have the grace, man, then maybe you have the wit to thank me for the mercy I have shown tonight," asked Matthias with a laugh. "Be sure I shall thank you," said Steinfinn, "if God grant me life." Now Matthias was dressed in a kirtle with open hanging sleeves and tassels at their points. He took the flap of his sleeve in his hand and whisked the tassel across Steinfinn's face, laughing yet louder. And of a sudden he drove his fist into the face of the bound man, so that the blood flowed from Steinfinn's mouth and nose. That done, he went out to his men. Olav Audunsson, Steinfinn's foster son, a boy of 11 years, ran forward and cut Steinfinn's bonds. The lad, Steinfinn's children, and their foster mothers had been dragged into the outer room and held there, while Matthias was speaking to his faithless betrothed and her man within. Steinfinn snatched a spear and, naked as he was, ran out after Matthias and his men as they rode down the steep slope straight across the ploughland, laughing scornfully. Steinfinn flung the spear, but it fell short. Meanwhile the boy Olav ran to the men's room and the byre and let out the serving men who had been barred in, while Steinfinn went back to the house, dressed himself, and took his arms. But all thought of pursuing Matthias was vain, for there were but 3 horses left at Prettestein, and they were loose in the paddock. Nevertheless Steinfinn rode off at once to seek his father and brothers. As he dressed, he had spoken in private with his wife. She came out with him when he was ready to set out, and now Steinfinn declared to his housefolk that he would not sleep with his wife until he had repaired the shame, so that no man could say she was his by the favour of Matthias Haraldsson. Then he rode forth, but his lady went into an old outhouse which stood in the courtyard, and locked herself in. The housefolk, men and women, streamed into the hall, eager to learn what had happened. They close questioned Olav, who sat half-clad on the edge of the bed that Steinfinn's weeping daughters had crept into. They turned to ask the 2 little maids and the foster mother of Steinfinn's youngest son. But none of these could tell them anything, and soon the servants grew tired of questioning and went out. The boy sat in the dark hall listening to Ingunn's obstinate weeping. Then he climbed up into the bed and lay down by her side. "Be sure your father will take vengeance. You may well believe he will do that. And I know I shall be with him, to show that Steinfinn has a son-in-law, though his sons are yet too young to bear arms." It was the first time Olav had dared to speak straight out of the betrothal that had been made between him and Ingunn when they were children. In the first years he spent at Prettestein, the servants had sometimes chanced to speak of it and tease the children with being betrothed, and it had always made Ingunn wild. Once she had run to her father and complained, and he had been angered and forbidden his people to speak of such things, so wrathfully that more than one of them had guessed that maybe Steinfinn repented his bargain with Olaf's father. That night Ingunn took Olaf's reminder of the plans that had been made for them in such a way that she crept up to the boy and wept upon his arm till the sleeve of his shirt was drenched with her tears. From that night a great change came over the life at Fretestein. Steinfinn's father and brothers counselled him to bring a suit against Matthias Haraldsson, but Steinfinn said that he himself would be the judge of what his honour was worth. Now, Matthias had gone straight home to the manor at Borgcecil where he dwelt, and the following spring he went on a pilgrimage in foreign lands. But when this was noised abroad, and it was known that Steinfinn's wrath was such that he shunned folk and would not live with his wife any more, then there was much talk of the vengeance that Matthias had taken upon his faithless betrothed. Even though Matthias and his men told no different tale of the raid from what was heard at Fretestein, it turned out that the farther the rumour spread over the country, the more cheaply folk judged that Steinfinn had been held by Matthias, and a ballad was made of these doings, as though they were thought to have fallen out. One evening, it was 3 years later, as Steinfinn sat drinking with his men, he asked if there were any who could sing the ballad that had been made upon him. At first all the housecarls made as though they knew nothing of any ballad, but when Steinfinn promised a great gift to him who could sing his dance, it came out that the whole household knew it. Steinfinn heard it to the end. Now and then he bared his teeth in a sort of smile. As soon as it was done, he went to bed together with his half-brother, Kolbein Thorisson, and the folk heard the two talking behind the bed-shutters till near midnight. This Kolbein was a son of Tor of Hove, by a concubine he had had before his marriage, and he had always cared more for his children by her than for those born in wedlock. For Kolbein he had made a good marriage, and got him a great farm to the northward, on Lake Mjøsa. But there was little thrift in Kolbein. He was overbearing, unjust, and of a hasty temper, and was ever in lawsuits, both with lesser men and with his equals. So he was a man of few friends, and there was little love between him and his true-born half-brothers, until, after his misfortune, Steinfinn took up with Kolbein. After that, these two brothers were always together, and Kolbein charged himself with Steinfinn and all his affairs. But he ordered them as he ordered his own, and brought trouble with him, even when he acted on his brother's behalf. Assuredly it was not that Kolbein had a will to harm his younger brother. He was fond of Steinfinn in his own way. After that, the younger in his perplexity had put himself wholly into his half-brother's hands. Careless and lazy Steinfinn had been in his days of prosperity. He had thought more of lordly living than of taking care for his estate. But after the night of the raid he shunned all men for a time. But afterwards, by Kolbein's advice, he took a whole band of housecarls into his service, young men well trained to arms, and by choice such as before had done lord's service elsewhere. Steinfinn and his men slept in the great hall, and they followed their master wherever he went. But they neither could nor would do much work on the estate, so that he had great cost and little gain of the whole band. Nevertheless, the farm work at Fretestein was seen to in a way, for the old bailiff Grim and Dalla, his sister, were children of one of Steinfinn's grandmother's thralls, and they had no thought beyond the welfare of their young master. But now, when Steinfinn had need of a return from his outlying farms, he cared neither to see nor to speak with his own tenants and bailiffs, and Kolbein, who took charge of all such matters in his stead, brought with him trouble without end. Ingeborg Jonsdatter had been a skilful housewife, and in former days this had made great amends for her husband's lavish and indolent ways. But now she hid herself in the little outhouse with her maids, and the rest of the household scarcely saw her. She spent her days in pondering and repining, never inquired of the condition of the house or estate, but rather seemed to be angered if any disturbed her thoughts. Even with her children, who lived with their mother in the outhouse, she was silent, caring little for how they fared or what they did. Yet before, in the good days, she had been a tender mother, and Steinfinnsons had been a happy and loving father, proud of their strong and handsome children. So long as her sons, Halvard and John, were still small, she often took them in her lap and sat rocking them, with her chin resting on their fair-haired crowns, while she moped, lost in sorrowful thought. But the boys were not very old before they grew weary of staying in the outhouse with their mournful mother and her women. Tora, the younger daughter, was a good and pretty child. She saw full well that her father and mother had suffered a grievous wrong, and were now full of cares and sorrow, and she strove to cheer them kindly and lovingly. She became the favourite of both. Steinfinn's face would brighten somewhat when he looked at this daughter of his. Tora Steinfinnsdatter was delicate and shapely in body and limbs. She ripened early into womanhood. She had a long, full face, a fair skin, and blue eyes. Thick plaits of smooth, corn-yellow hair hung over her shoulders. Her father stroked her cheek. "A good child you are, Tora mine. God bless you. Go to your mother, Tora. Sit with her and comfort her." Tora went and sat down spinning or sewing beside her sorrowful mother. And she thought herself more than rewarded if Ingeborg said at the last, "You are good, Tora mine. God preserve you from all evil, my child." Then Tora's tears began to fall. She thought upon her parents' heavy lot, and, full of righteous wrath, she looked at her sister, who had never enough constancy to sit still with their mother, and could not come into the outhouse without making her impatient with her continual restlessness, till Ingeborg bade her go out again. And Ingunn made for the door, carefree and unrepentant, and ran out to play and shout with the other children of the place, Olav and some boys belonging to the serving folk at Fretestein. Ingunn was the eldest of all Steinfinns and Ingeborg's children. When she was little, she had been marvellously fair, but now she was not half as pretty as her sister, people thought. And she had not so much sense, nor was she very quick-witted. She was neither better nor worse than are most children. But in a way she was as much liked by the people of the place as the quiet and beautiful younger sister. Steinfinn's men looked upon Tora with a sort of reverence, but they were better pleased to have Ingunn among them in the hall. There were no maids of her own age either at Fretestein or any of the farms and homesteads round about. So it was that Ingunn was always with the boys. She took part in all their games and all their pursuits, practised such sports as they used. She threw the spear and the stone, shot with the bow, struck the ball, set snares in the wood, and fished in the tarn. But she was clumsy at all these things, neither handy nor bold, but weak, quick to give up and take to tears when their play grew rough or the game went against her. For all that, the boys let her go with them everywhere. For one thing, she was Steinfinn's daughter, and then Olav Audunsson would have it so. And it was always Olav who was master of their games. Olav Audunsson was well liked by all on the estate, both great and small, and yet none would have called him a winning child. It seemed that none could come at the heart of this boy, although he was never unfriendly toward any living soul. Rather might it be said that he was good-natured and helpful in his taciturn and absent way. Handsome he was, though he was fair of skin and hair as an albino almost. But he had not the albino's sidelong glance or bowed neck. Olaf's blue-green eyes were pale in colour, but he looked the world straight in the face with them, and he carried his head erect upon his strong, milk-white neck. It was as though sun and wind had little power upon that skin of his. It seemed strangely tight and smooth and white. Only in summer a few small freckles appeared over the root of the nose, which was low and broad. This healthy paleness gave Olaf's face, even in childhood, something of a cold, impassive look. His features, too, were somewhat short and broad, but well formed. The eyes lay rather far apart, but they were large and frankly open. The eyebrows and lashes were so fair that they showed but as a golden shadow in the sunlight. His nose was broad and straight, but a little too short. His mouth was rather large, but the lips were so finely curved and firm that, had they not been so pale in the colourless face, they might have been called handsome. But his hair was of matchless beauty, so fair that it shone like silver rather than gold, thick and soft and lightly curled. He wore it trimmed so that it covered his broad white forehead, but showed the hollow in his neck between the two powerful muscles. Olaf was never tall for his age, but he seemed bigger than he was, of perfect build, sturdy and muscular, with very small hands and feet, which seemed the stronger because the wrists and ankles were so round and powerful. And indeed he was very strong and supple. He excelled in all kinds of sport and in the use of arms, but there was none who had ever taught him to practice these exercises in the right way. As things stood at Fretterstein in his growing up, Olaf was left to his own devices. Steinfinn, who had promised to be a father to him when he took charge of the boy, did nothing to give him such training as was meet for a young man of good birth, heir to some fortune, and destined to be the husband of Ingunn Steinfinnsdatter. That Steinfinn Thorisson was Olaf's foster-father had come about in this way. One summer, while Steinfinn was still in goodly case, it chanced that he had business at the Icelander. He went thither with friends and kinsmen, and took with him his wife and their daughter Ingunn, who was then 6 years old. The parents had such joy of the pretty child that they could not be without her. Here at the Thing, Steinfinn met a man, Audun Ingolfsson of Hestviken. Audun and Steinfinn had been bedfellows in the king's bodyguard, and good friends, though Audun was older than the other, and the men were of very unlike humour. For at that time Steinfinn was merry and loved to talk of himself, but Audun was a silent man, and never spoke of his own affairs. In the spring of the same year that King Hakon was away warring in Scotland, Audun was married. He took a Danish wife, Cecilia Bjornsdatter, Queen Ingeborg's playmate, who had been with her at the convent of Rind. When the Bishop of Oslo took young King Magnus's bride by force and carried her to Norway, because the Dane king slighted the compact and refused to send his kinswoman thither, Cecilia went with her. At first the young queen would fain have kept the damsel always with her, but a year later the Lady Ingeborg seemed already to have changed her mind, and she was eager to have Cecilia married. Some said it was because King Magnus himself liked to talk with the Danish maid more than his wife cared for. Others declared that it was young Alf Erlingsson of Tornberg who had won her heart, but his father, Baron Erling Alfsson, would not let his son take a foreign wife who owned neither land nor powerful kinsfolk in Norway. Young Alf was a man of fiery nature and wont to have his will in all things, and he loved Cecilia madly. The queen therefore took counsel to marry off the maid, lest some misfortune might befall her. However these things might be, the maid herself was chaste and full of grace. And after Audun, who at first had seemed somewhat unwilling, had spoken 2 or 3 times with Cecilia, he himself was eager to take her. Their wedding was held at the king's court in Bjorgvin. Old King Hakon gave the bride a marriage portion. Audun carried his wife to Hestviken. There she was well secured, whether from King Magnus or from Alf Erlingsson. In the course of the summer, Audun with his ship joined the king at Herdlevarg and followed him westward over sea. And when the king died in the Orkneys before Yule, it was in the winter of 1263, Audun commanded the ship which brought the news to Norway. Then he journeyed on to the east, home to his manor. In the summer he came back to King Magnus's bodyguard. His wife had then died in giving birth to a son, who lived. Audun had grown even more silent than before, but now he uttered one thing and another of his affairs to Steinfinn. At Hestviken dwelt his grandfather. He was old and somewhat self-willed. He had been against his grandson's marriage with a foreign wife without kindred. Besides him, there was in the house an old uncle of Audun. He was mad. Most of the time she had lived at Hestviken, Cecilia had been left alone with these 2 old men. "It misgives me she had no happy life there in the east," said Audun. In the great-grandfather's honour, Cecilia had named the child after him. It was the Danish custom. But Olav Audunsson was greatly angered thereat. "In Norway no child is called after a living man, save with the thought of putting him out of life," said he. It fell out that Audun was left sole heir to these 2 old men, but he let it be known that he would not go home to Hestviken for a while. He was minded to bide in Bjorgvin with King Magnus. It was a short time after this that Steinfinn carried off Ingeborg, and since then he had neither heard nor sought tidings of Audun Ingolfsson, until he met the man at the Thing. Audun was leading a boy of 7 years by the hand, and was asking for certain men from Soljar whom he was to meet there. He looked very sick. Audun was a tall man, and had always been very spare and slim, with a narrow face, a thin and sharp hooked nose, and his skin and hair were fair to whiteness. Now he was bent in the back and gaunt as a skeleton, wan-faced and blue about the lips. But the boy was a strong and comely child, broad-shouldered and of good build. He was as fair of hue as his father, but in other ways he bore him no great likeness. Steinfinn embraced his friend with riotous joy, but it filled him with grief to see that Audun was so sick. He would hear of naught else, but that Audun must go with him to the house where Steinfinn and his following lived, while the thing lasted. On the way thither, Audun told him that these men he was to have met were the sons of his grandfather's nephew. "And nearer kinsmen have I none. It will fall to them to be the guardians of Olaf here when I am dead." The 2 old men at Hestviken were still living, but they were clean decrepit, and for himself he had an inward scathe in his stomach, so that he had no good of meat or drink. He could not live many weeks more. He had been with King Magnus all these years, until lately, before Yule. Then he went home to Hestviken, being very sick. He had not seen his own house more than once since his wife's death, so it was only this winter that he had come to know his son. But now the child's future lay heavily on his heart, and here these kinsmen from Soljar had failed to come, and he scarce had the strength to ride up to them. It gave him such pain to ride. And this was the last day but one of the thing. The fathers of Hovdo would gladly take him, but should the boy have a mind to stay there when he grows up and make himself a monk, then our kin would die out with him. When Ingeborg saw the fair child, who would soon be both motherless and fatherless, she was fain to kiss the boy. But Olaf wrested himself from her and fled to his father, while he stared at the lady with his great blue eyes, full of ill-humour and surprise. "Will you not kiss my wife, Olaf?" asked Steinfinn with a mighty laugh. "No," answered the lad, "for outlawed kisses Kol." Audun smiled somewhat uneasily. These were two old folks who served at Hestviken, he said. And at that all the grown people laughed greatly, and Olaf turned red and looked at the ground. Then his father chid him and bade him greet Ingeborg courteously and properly, so he had to go forward and be kissed by the lady. And when little Ingunn came out and said that she too would kiss the boy, Olaf dutifully went up and bent forward, so that the little maid could reach his lips. But his face was red as fire, and his eyes were full of tears, so that the men laughed and bantered Olaf that he set so little store by the favour of fair women. But as the evening wore on, when the folk had supped and sat over their drink, Olaf seemed to thaw a little. Ingunn ran about among the benches, and where she found an empty place, she climbed up and sat for a while swinging her legs, then slipped down again, ran to another place, and crept up there. This made the grown ones laugh. They called to her and caught at her, and the child grew more and more wanton and wild. Then it seemed that Olaf had made a great resolution. He rose up from beside his father, straightened his new knife belt, walked across the hall, and sat down by Ingunn's side. And when she slid down and ran to another seat, the boy followed her, holding back a little, and seated himself again beside her. Thus the children played hither and thither among the benches, with laughter and cries from Ingunn, while Olaf followed, steady and serious. But now and again he glanced at his father, and a faltering smile came over the boy's mute and handsome face. The children were nodding in a corner by the time Steinfinn and Audun came and led them out to the hearth in the midst of the hall. The guests formed a ring about them. They were far gone in drink. Steinfinn himself was unsteady on his legs as he took his daughter's hand and laid it in Olaf's. Then Steinfinn and Audun clenched the bargain of their children's betrothal with a hand-clasp. And Audun gave Olaf a gold ring, and helped him to set it on Ingunn's little hand, and hold up the child's fingers so that all might see the massive ring dangling there. Ingeborg Jonsdatter and the women laughed and cried by turns, for no fairer sight than this little bridal pair had any of them seen. Then she handed her daughter a horn, and bade her drink to her betrothed, and the children drank and spilled the liquor over their clothes. Steinfinn stood, holding his friend round the neck. With tears in his voice, he swore solemnly that Audun had no need to grieve for the child he left behind him. He would foster Olaf himself, and stand in his father's stead till the boy was a man, and could bring home his bride, said Steinfinn, and kissed Audun on both cheeks, while Ingeborg took the children in her arms and promised to be a mother to Olaf, for the sake of Cecilia Bjornsdatter, whom she had loved as her own sister. Then they told Olaf he must kiss his betrothed. and now the boy went forward right boldly, laid his arms about Ingunn's neck, and kissed her as warmly as he could, while the witnesses laughed and drank the health of the affianced pair. And it seemed as though Olaf had now learned to like the sport. All at once he sprang at his young bride, took her round the neck again, and gave her 3 or 4 smacking kisses. Then all the company roared with laughter, and called to him to keep on with it. Whether it was the laughter that made her ashamed, or a whim of the little maid, Ingunn tried to struggle out of the boy's arms, and as he only clasped her the closer, she bit him in the cheek with all her might. Olaf stood staring for a moment, fairly amazed. Then he rubbed his cheek, where drops of blood were oozing out. He looked at his bloody fingers, and then made to fly at Ingunn and strike her. But his father lifted him in his arms and carried him away to the bed, where they were to sleep. And then the affianced bride and bridegroom were undressed and put to bed. And soon they fell asleep and forgot the whole company. Next day, when Steinfinn was sober, he would fain have been quit of his bargain. He dropped some hints that it was all done in jest. If they were to make any compact for their children's future, they must first take counsel about it. But Audun, who had been kept from drinking by his sickness, opposed him in this. He bade the other remember that he had given his promise to a dying man, and that God would assuredly avenge it if he broke his word to a forlorn and fatherless child. Steinfinn pondered. Audun Ingolfsson came of a good and ancient kindred, though it was now short of men and had little power. But Olaf was an only child, and even if he could not look for much heritage beyond his ancestral seat of Hestviken, this was nevertheless a great estate. He himself might yet have many children in his marriage. Olaf might well be a fit match for Ingunn, with her daughter's portion after him. So Steinfinn sober took up the word he had spoken in his drink, promised to foster Olaf and give him his daughter in marriage when the 2 children should come to years of discretion. And when he rode home from the thing, he took Olav Audunsson north with him. The same autumn there came tidings to Fretestein that Olaf's father was dead, a short time after his grandfather and the mad uncle. The messengers brought with them a part of the child's heritage from his father and mother in chattels, clothing, arms, and a casket of jewels. His estate of Hestviken was left in the charge of an old kinsman of the boy, one they called Olaf Half-Priest. Steinfinn took his foster son's goods in keeping, and he so far bestirred himself that twice he sent messages with folks who had errands in Oslo to appoint a meeting with Olaf Half-Priest. But nothing came of it at that time, and afterwards Steinfinn took no further step. It was the way with Steinfinn that he was no very active man, even when his own affairs were at stake. Both he and Ingeborg were kind to Olaf, and he was treated as a child of theirs, till the trouble came upon them. And after that, their foster son was happily no more neglected than their own offspring. In a way, Olaf had been quick to feel at home at Fretestein. He liked Steinfinn and Ingeborg well enough, but he was a quiet-mannered, rather reticent child, so he was always something of a stranger to them. He never had any true feeling that he belonged to the house, though he was happier here than where he came from. As far as he could, he left off thinking of his first home, Hestviken. But now and then memories of that time came up in him, and it caught him with a clutch of despondency when he called to mind all the old folks there. The serving men were worn out with age, and his great-grandfather was ever plaguing his mad old son, whom folk called Foulbeard. He had to be fed like a child and kept away from fire and water and edged tools. Olaf had mostly been left to fend for himself. But he had never known any other ways, and the filth and evil stench that followed Foulbeard had been a part of the life of the place as far back as the boy could remember. And he had also grown so used to the madman's fits of howling and shrieking that they frightened him not so much. But he shrank from these memories. Sometimes, in his last years, his great-grandfather had taken him to church with him, and there he had had a sight of strangers, women and children too, but he never had a thought that he might mix with them or talk with them. They seemed to be a part of the mass. And for many years after he had come to Fretestein, it might chance that he would have a sudden feeling of loneliness, as though his life here with these people were unreal, or not an everyday thing, like a church Sunday, and he were only waiting to go away, back to the life from which he had come. This was never more than a flash of memory, which came and vanished again at once. But he never came to feel wholly rooted at Fretestein, though he had no longing for another home. But at times memories of another kind arose, which stabbed his heart with a sharp longing. Like the return of an old dream, he remembered a bare outcrop of rock in the midst of the yard at Hestviken. There were cracks in the warm rock, and he had lain there picking out moss with a splinter of bone. Pictures floated before his eyes of places where he had once wandered alone, filling them with his own fancies, and these memories brought an aftertaste of unutterable sweetness. Behind the cowsheds in the yard there was a lofty cliff of smooth, dark rock over which water trickled, and in the swampy hollow between the cliff and the outhouses it was always dark and shady, with a growth of tall green rushes. And there was somewhere a stretch of beach where he trod on seaweed and rattling pebbles, and found snail shells and bits of rotten wood, water-worn and green with slime. Outside, the water lay glittering into the far distance, and the old housecarl, Cole, used to open mussels and give them to him. Olaf's mouth watered when he recalled the fine taste of sea-water and the rich yellow morsel which he sopped up from the open blue shell. When such memories glimmered within him, he grew silent and answered absently if Ingunn spoke to him, but it never came into his head to go away and leave her. He never had a thought of parting company with her when she came and wanted to be with him, any more than he thought he could part from himself. Thus it was with Olav Audunsson. It seemed his very destiny that he should always be with Ingunn. It was the only sure thing in his life that he and Ingunn were inseparably joined together. He seldom thought of that evening when they had been betrothed, and it was now many years since any had spoken of the children's affiancing. But amid all his thoughts and feelings, it was as firm ground under his feet that he should always live with Ingunn. The boy had no kinsman to rely on. He knew that Hestviken was now his own, but with every year that went by, his images of the place grew fainter and fainter. It was but fragments of a dream he remembered. When he thought that one day he would go to live there, the fixed and real part of his thought was that he should take Ingunn with him. Together they would face the uncertain future. He never thought whether she was fair or not. Tora was fair, it seemed to him, perhaps because he had heard it said so often. Ingunn was only Ingunn, near at hand and every day and always at his side. He never thought of how she might be, otherwise than as one thinks of the weather. That has to be taken as it comes. He grew angry and scolded her when she was contrary or troublesome. He had beaten her too when they were smaller. When she was kind and fair-spoken with him and the other boys, their playmates, he felt happy as in fine weather. And mostly they were good friends, like brother and sister, who got on well together. At whiles they might be angry and quarrel, but neither thought the other's nature could be changed from what it was. And among the band of children at Fretterstein, of whom none took any heed, these two, the eldest, kept together, because they knew that, whatever happened, one thing was certain, that they should be together. This was the only sure thing, and it was good to have something sure. The boy, growing up alone in the home of a strange kin, struck root, without knowing it, in her who was promised to him, and his love, for the only one he well knew of all that was to be his, grew as he himself grew, without his marking the growth. He cherished her as a habit, until his love took on a colour and brightness that showed him how wholly he was filled thereby. Things went on in this wise until the summer when Olav Audunsson had ended his 16th year. Ingunn was now 15 winters old,